Depth perception is an important part of the human sensory suite that we often take for granted. It's quite impressive that we can take the two-dimensional footage that we get from our eyes and convert that into a comprehensive understanding of the 3D world around us. We do this partly by observing the relative size of the objects we see and how much our perspective on the object changes when we move. Unsurprisingly, the brain does a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to making sense of the visual. But one of the main tools we have at our disposal for judging depth is binocular vision. Binocular or stereoscopic vision means that you have two eyes. Having two eyes provides you with two vantage points for the same object. This gives you a more accurate idea of how far away it is, because you can use the differences between the perspectives of your eyes combined with the distance between them to know how far away objects are. This all happens with almost no thought from you and in a fraction of a second. This feeling of depth is so integral to our understanding of reality that we constantly look for the illusion of it in visual media. Depth makes two-dimensional representations look like they are part of our 3D plane, which is why art feels more lifelike when there is a clear adherence to a certain perspective in 3D space. One way to enhance this feeling in an art piece is stereoscopic 3D, which is the main topic of this video. Stereoscopic 3D works by showing two slightly different perspectives on the same scene to each of your eyes, in a way that imitates binocular vision. Your brain then processes the two images in the same way it would real life. In this video, we will be going over a few of the delivery methods for stereoscopic 3D that we've come up with over the years. The first medium to make the leap into the third dimension was drawings. This happened when Charles Wheatstone invented a viewing device called the Stereoscope in 1832 that would show two images to each eye using mirrors. Viewing the slightly offset drawings at the same time creates an illusion of perspective and makes it look like the 2D images are a single 3D image. Wheatstone's work is integral to our understanding of binocular vision in general, as he was the first person to explain how we perceive depth using binocular vision. This version of stereoscopy is the backbone of arguably all of the 3D technologies that have come since. Around the time stereoscopes were invented, cameras were a brand new concept and were rapidly getting better. This meant that pictures could be used in lieu of drawings in stereoscopes. To keep up with the new medium, the following decades would foster many advancements to 3D technology. For example, people noticed that there would be differences in weather conditions and objects would move around between pictures being taken, especially since these early cameras took up to 8 hours to take a picture. Cameras were then made which had two lenses separated by an appropriate distance. This allowed both needed pictures to be taken at the same time and greatly reduced inconsistencies between shots. Scottish physicist Scat fetishist David Brewster would also come out with a variation of the stereoscope that used lenses rather than mirrors to focus view on the pictures. The lenses needed for this device were so high quality that Brewster could not find anyone to manufacture them in England, which is why he turned to a famed French instrument maker of the time, Jules Dubosc. Dubosc made many of Brewster's new stereoscopes. He used the brand new daguerreotype picture process, which printed images onto a silver-coated copper plate, as opposed to the English calotype images, which were printed onto silver nitrate-soaked paper. They both operated on the principle that silver was sensitive to light under certain conditions, but daguerreotypes were much higher quality images. Unlike the Wheatstone stereoscopes, which could take up a whole tabletop, they were small enough to be a handheld device. This new design was of great fascination to many people of the time, most notably Queen Victoria, who was mesmerized by them at the Great Exhibition of 1851. The subsequent buzz helped stereoscopes gain a new level of acclaim, selling 250,000 units in 3 months, and it's easy to see why, as they were essentially VR headsets in an era where photo cameras had barely hit the mainstream. Stereoscopes were cool, but they had a few obvious drawbacks. It was impossible for more than one person at a time to use them, and while seeing pictures in 3D would have been novel for the time, it's easy to see how that would get boring. The beginning of the solution came in 1858, when Joseph d'Almeida used one of the first color anaglyph systems to convert magic lantern slideshows into 3D and show them to crowds, using green and red filters. The way it worked was by taking advantage of the fact that only light of the same color can pass through a colored filter. This is why red tinted glasses make everything red and green makes it green. When he superimposed a green tinted slide on a red tinted slide and shone a white light through them, only green and red light was emitted from the screen. Users would wear glasses with filters in them, green for one eye and red for the other. This meant that only the green eye would see the green frames and vice versa. Making the slides differ slightly creates an illusion of depth. The mix of green and red would discolor the original slides and give them more of a yellowish hue. This was solved by adding a third color to the mix, blue. But how did they add a third color when you only have two lenses to work with? No, not like that. Blue was instead added to the green filter using a cyan lens. This meant that all the primary colors were present. I know they're not technically the primary colors, but for our purposes, they are. And since they're complementary, the resulting colors have no hue, meaning that they're on the grayscale. As you probably guessed a couple of paragraphs ago, this was the birth of the iconic blue and red 3D movie glasses that are arguably still synonymous with 3D in general to this day. In the late 19th to early 20th centuries, these new things called motion pictures were beginning to pick up a lot of steam. These movies were not the huge cinematic experiences that we have now. Most of these movies were a compilation of simple scenes that were easy to understand without dialogue, with a live band or pianist in the background. These early movie houses were called Nickelodeons. A nickel was the price of admission, and Odeon is the Greek word for a roofed theater. The rise of the American middle class combined with a low door fee meant that movies exploded in popularity, and filmmakers would have to begin experimenting with new ideas to provide the best viewing experience. One such attempt came from Harry Farrell with his 1922 movie, The Power of Love. This was the first movie to use the color anaglyph system to simulate a 3D effect. Reviewers raved about the incredible new technology that went into the movie, and the film certainly fascinated technology and film enthusiasts, but among the public it saw modest success, only being shown using its revolutionary 2-camera 2-projector format once. A year later, the film was acquired by the Selznick Distribution Company, who released it as a 2D movie under the name Forbidden Lover. This re-release had a gimmick which allowed moviegoers to see either the happy ending or the sad ending, depending on whether they wore fully red-tinted glasses or green ones. Since both lenses were the same color, they would completely block out the other colored frames. The result was a single 2D image with no depth effect. Many more of its kind, like The Man from Mars, Plastograms, Audioscopics, and
Nozze Vagabonde
came out subsequently. None of them saw immense success, however, and at this time, 3D film was still far from widespread adoption. As the years passed, however, the already small public interest in 3D film and cinema in general had dwindled significantly. This was due in great part to the Great Depression and World War II, which gave people a little more to worry about than Tarzan and his mate, followed closely by the explosion in popularity of televisions, which were becoming affordable enough for your average consumer to get one. This was until the first 3D movie in color, Buona Devil, was released in 1952.
Never before has the color camera captured such savage jungle violence as killer lions terrorize a fierce warrior tribe and a relentless white hunter challenges death itself for the love of his beautiful bride. It's the unforgettable African adventure story that made screen history.
Although people had been experimenting with polarized stereoscopic projection as far back as the 1890s, it would only come to the silver screen with the release of this film. Color anaglyph 3D was not going to work for a 3D movie in color, so Archo Bowler and Milton Gunsberg implemented the Natural Vision 3D system, which used polarizing lenses instead of the widely used cyan and red glasses of the time. If you have knowledge of polarization and how it works, you may skip to this point in the video. For those of you who have a life, stay with me. A ray of light, being an electromagnetic wave, has oscillating electric waves. This means that as light travels forwards, there are electric waves and magnetic waves, but that's not important right now, oscillating in every direction around the light. What a polarizing lens does is it only allows waves vibrating in a particular direction to move through it. For example, if you place one of them such that only vertical waves pass through the lens, the light would be polarized vertically. When you have two lenses, one polarizing vertically and the other horizontally, you can send a different image to each eye using polarization filters. Buona Devil. While panned by critics at the time, Buona Devil was a great financial success off the back of the technical feat of 3D in color alone. This movie was the first time a somewhat mainstream audience was wowed by stereoscopic 3D. And like popular things tend to do, it spawned a litany of copycats. During the next few years was the greatest 3D craze that had ever been. It's worth noting that this boom was toward the tail end of the so-called golden age of Hollywood, when revenue from movies increased exponentially. This likely meant that studios had more money to spend on expensive and innovative filmmaking practices. In the years following the early 50s, there was a sharp decline in the number of 3D movies being made, but polarization remains the standard for 3D media to this day. 3D in movies had seen a meteoric rise in popularity in the early 50s, but in the following decades they had a really hard time making their mark. I can only speculate that this was a result of the first golden age of television, in which many broadcasters experimented with new genres of TV like sitcoms, game shows, and sports programs, which are cornerstones of TV programming to this day. When you consider how much more equipment and time is involved in filming and releasing a movie in 3D, it's not surprising that studios were less inclined to invest in them. These factors caused an astronomical decline in the amount of 3D movies being made, going from 62 3D movies released in the 1950s to just 8 in the 1960s. There was a small resurgence of 3D in the 1980s with films like Friday the 13th Part 3, Amityville 3D, and Jaws, you guessed it, 3D, which complemented the visceral thrill of these movies by using the extra dimension of depth to further immerse the audience. The feeling of actively being at the center of the action that 3D provides is perfect for inducing fear, which is why many of these movies have become iconic within the horror genre. This smaller wave of 3D films stopped before the end of the 80s, however, and for more than a decade, 3D movies became few and far between, with only 12 3D movies dropping in the 90s compared to the previous decade's 30. Furthermore, of those 12 films, 8 were just theme park attractions that used 3D to enhance the experience. That leaves us with just 4 actual 3D movies released in the 90s. 3D seemed to be an age-old novelty struggling to maintain mainstream relevance, until 2003, when another deluge of 3D movies flooded theaters. Disney had James Cameron's Titanic documentary, Ghost of the Abyss, lead the charge, and every big production company followed suit. That period marks a shift in the way 3D movies were positioned and thought of by the public. Until now, 3D movies had been an event. Most of them were made and heavily marketed with this in mind. But in the late to mid 2000s, it became expected that every major release would offer a 3D version of the film. The line between 2D and 3D movies became extremely blurred. All of this came to a head with the release of, again, James Cameron's Avatar in 2009. Which set a new standard for 3D cinema and pushed boundaries for CGI visuals in general. Audiences were enamored by this movie, and it remained the highest grossing movie of all time for almost a decade. At this point, 3D was already gaining steam, but Avatar pushed the craze to the limit. The number of 3D movies being made matched and then completely eclipsed the insanity of the 1950s. This skyrocket in attention for 3D movies made many media companies attempt to replicate the success with home entertainment, and thus the 2010s 3D TV craze was born. The year is 2010. At this point, people gladly paid extra to watch 3D movies in theaters, but studios wanted to transfer that same success to home releases, probably to further make up for the extra cost of making a 3D movie. From the TV manufacturer's point of view, 3D was a lot more immediately compelling than almost any selling point you could slap on a TV. High resolution or better color accuracy could not hold a candle to 3D in terms of superficial wow factor, especially for the average consumer at the time, who had just been exposed to a new era of 3D in theaters. And since it is notoriously hard to get people to upgrade their TV if it still works, television manufacturers took the opportunity to ride this wave very seriously. TV broadcasters seemed to be on board as well. Many of the biggest ones around the world like Sky, Canal, Cablevision, BBC, and more added 3D channels to their lineup at the time. These TVs mostly all used the same polarized 3D system that theaters use. However, the tech had a few drawbacks when used on the old boob tube. First of all, while polarizing lenses were rather cheap, the polarizing filters necessary for the process to work at all are quite expensive, and drove up the price of the TVs by a lot. In a movie theater, the costs are shared between every moviegoer, so the increase in price for the individual is relatively minimal. And for a single person, the price increase was often too steep. This was without even considering the price of the decoder or 3D Blu-ray player that you'd need to even output to the TV. The actual 3D effect was a lot less spectacular when seen on the TV, regardless of how good it is. That is because a TV compared to a movie screen takes up a lot less of your field of view, which makes it less immersive. A hand reaching out of an all-encompassing screen will always be scarier than one reaching out of the TV 10 feet away from you in your brightly lit living room. And while some really big channels could afford to keep a steady stream of 3D content coming, most of them could not, which left users with a rather small selection of 3D content for home viewing outside of expensive 3D Blu-rays. Polarized 3D also makes you lose half of your resolution, because rows of pixels are dedicated to one eye or the other, leaving you with a less sharp image. If you're watching a movie on a 1080p display for example, instead of viewing it in 1080 by 1920 resolution, you're viewing it in 540 by 1920. This is a lot less of an issue when you're at a cinema with multiple 4K projectors or even watching a TV with above Full HD resolution, but those were extremely rare and expensive at the time. One cool implementation of polarization in TVs outside of 3D was for displaying different content to different users using the same television. Similarly to the different endings of Forbidden Lover, if one user puts on vertically polarized glasses and the other puts on horizontally polarized glasses, they can both be looking at the same TV but see completely different images. This could be used in a multiplayer video game so that instead of splitting the screen in the middle, you both get the whole TV. It could also be implemented in tandem with headphones so that two shows can be watched at the same time on the same TV. Both of these scenarios are incredibly niche though and require high amounts of bandwidth and processing power, so the feature was never widely implemented even within the 3D TV space. There were also many TVs that used active shutters in favor of polarization. Instead of using polarizing lenses to filter the light from the TV, they use a regular lens with a rapid shutter on it. When the left eye's image is on screen, the right shutter is closed and vice versa. They alternate between each other as needed dozens of times per second. They switch so fast that the viewer does not even realize that their eyes are covered for half of the movie. This came with its own host of issues however. To begin with, the glasses you had to use were a ton more expensive than the polarized ones. They were also bigger to account for a battery and the mechanical shutter going into it. This led to a less comfortable viewing experience as the glasses were cumbersome. The aforementioned batteries also need to be powered. This meant that the glasses must be charged between uses. It didn't help that by virtue of being closed for half of the time you used them, the glasses made everything look dimmer. This was because the constantly opening and closing shutter on the glasses doesn't give the eyes that much light to work with. In addition to that, they would also sometimes cause the image on screen to flicker, which could range from mildly annoying to potentially causing seizures in epileptic viewers. However, there is one big advantage that active 3D has over polarized or passive 3D, and this is that the image being delivered will always be in its original resolution, since they don't need to split pixels between your eyes. Dim Full HD is still Full HD. For most people, it was hard to justify experimenting with 3D TV given all of its compromises and the considerable price difference from regular TVs. This meant that they would largely hang out on store shelves for a long time. The lack of public interest led to many television companies having little incentive to support home 3D content. Pretty much all of them have completely forgone 3D broadcasts, and all but a few of the old 3D channels are now terminated. This in turn lowered interest in 3D TV even more, and this cycle repeated itself until 3D television was nothing more than a distant forgotten trend. In general, the point of 3D is to make an art piece more immersive and help the viewer feel like a part of its world. Video games have a similar appeal. It's easier to feel invested in a world that's constantly affected by your own actions. Therefore, it's not hard to see why we try and blend the two into an ultra-immersive experience. As far back as 1982, people were using Stereo 3D to bring games out of the screen, so let's look at some of the ways this was done. We're talking about notable 3D technology, so you already knew this would be here before you opened the video. Few things come to mind before the latest 3D device by one of the veterans of the industry, I am of course talking about the Sega Scope.
Now, Sega challenges you to experience Sega Scope 3D.
The Sega Scope is an accessory for the Sega Master System that allowed you to play 3D ports of arcade games like Space Harrier and Zaxxon. The way this add-on works is with the active shutter glasses that we discussed earlier. Same deal, if a frame is meant for the left eye, they blind your right eye and vice versa. Going with the theme, there is a catch to this. Whenever the 3D effect is turned on, the frame rate of the game halves. When you take the Sega Master System that's already on its knees trying to run these demanding arcade games, and you halve the frame rate further, let's just say it's not an amazing experience. It is possible to ignore it in games that ran at 60 frames per second natively, but the rest of them felt anywhere from jarring to unplayable. The glasses were also rather big. Even the modern active shutter glasses are sometimes bulky and uncomfortable, so it's no surprise that the Sega Scope glasses were similarly unwieldy. They were still impressively small for what they were at the time, but they were noticeably bigger than regular or even polarized glasses. From what I could gather, the 3D effect was implemented to various degrees of effectiveness, being quite impressive in games like Outrun and Missile Defense, but underwhelming in Poseidon Wars 3D, which lacked an appealing visual identity as a foundation for the 3D effect. All in all, it seems like the Sega Scope was a nice obscure add-on for the console that allowed more dedicated players to enhance titles they loved despite the shortcomings of Active Shutter 3D.
Sega Scope 3D, only on the Sega system. Sega, the challenge will always be there.
Another guy we'll discuss today is the Nintendo Virtual Boy. If you're watching this far into the video, then you've definitely heard of it by now. The console simulates 3D using two screens on each side of the device in a manner that's reminiscent of the Wheatstone Stereoscope. The screens on both sides are actually just two 1 pixel wide vertical LED arrays. They reflect off an oscillating mirror that takes the line of lights and spreads it throughout your field of view by rotating the mirrors back and forth at high speed. Moving the vertical light array to and fro makes it look like a full rectangular image. It's well known that the console provided an abysmal experience, with the way the display works meaning that the only colors you get to look at are the eternal void and red. The stereoscopic effect was unpleasant and nauseating for most. At the time of its release, there were concerns that the console would cause eye strain and neck strain. Nintendo even states on the box in big letters that children under 7 years old are not to use the system as it may cause developmental problems in the eyes. That probably didn't do too much for the public perception of a console that was known to cause seizures in some extreme cases. Due to weak sales, the Virtual Boy was discontinued in 1996, about a year after its initial release. Nintendo would step away from 3D until February of 2011 when they released the Nintendo 3DS, a handheld that could display 3D without the need for glasses. The 3DS used a parallax barrier, which is a second LCD display placed on top of the original one. It only allows light rays to come out of each pixel at a certain angle. By doing so, it only sends light meant for the left eye to the left and vice versa. The main issue with this tech is that both eyes, and therefore the user, have to stay a certain distance away from the device and only viewed from a certain angle, since the light will only be sent to a specific area. If you don't use the device under those specific conditions, the image can quickly become blurry. This problem was mitigated with the release of the new 3DS in 2015, which could electronically shift the barrier and adjust the angle at which light is sent, which in tandem with an infrared camera that could track the position of your eyes, greatly increased the range at which you could use the feature comfortably. The 3DS is a neat little system with hardware that was just good enough and a great library of games. After a slow start, it ended up selling over 75 million units, which is impressive in an era where mobile games eat more and more into that area of the market. 3D video games, while an interesting proposition, was not interesting enough to the average consumer to justify its price, which is why most of that hardware gets price cuts at some point. There are also many difficulties that come with researching and developing hardware that supports Stereo 3D before you can even get into the software. These factors meant that there were few major attempts at a 3D console or anything of the like. Now, the implementation of 3D effects in games, and I guess media in general, has been seemingly replaced or perfected by VR headsets like the HTC Vive and Oculus Rift, which share some DNA with older 3D machines, especially the Virtual Boy. They are arguably in the same space as the products we've discussed today, but I won't be getting into them in this video since we have mostly focused on technologies that have run their course here. So that's a pretty broad summary of the 3D things people have made over the years. Thanks for liking, please watch and subscribe, peace. Nintendo would step away from fuck, man.